Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our in this instance I mean myself and perhaps anyone whose work I'm reading whose opinion might leak through in some way from that work. In any event, as you can see, I'm broadcasting to you from an undisclosed location. I'm doing my best to stay out of the studio, the radio studio, so that I'm not sharing any germs with anybody. And so I'm doing this from home, from one of my many rooms in my house. Anyway, so I am here, and this or in another room is where you will see me for the near future. And this is where I'm broadcasting from, so I apologize for a lack of proper background and lighting and all that sort of thing. In any event, as you might imagine, speaking of pandemics, this episode will be about immigration and in a time of pandemic. And there are any number of stories to choose from. I will just share some of the ones that I selected that I thought would be the most interesting and useful for you right now. So the first one is entitled 13 Changes to the U.S. Immigration System During the Coronavirus Pandemic. As the United States responds to the coronavirus pandemic, the Trump administration has made sweeping changes to the country's immigration apparatus, altering daily operations and disrupting the lives of thousands. In a little over a week, there have been more than a dozen changes, ranging from postponing immigration hearings to pausing deportation flights to certain countries and suspending refugee admissions. The tweaks to the system are being made incrementally, though rapidly, as the pandemic spreads across the country. Against the backdrop of the outbreak, the Trump administration is also trying to move forward with some of its most restrictionist policies that have struggled to be put into practice, including blocking entry to asylum seekers. Citing the unscreened and unvetted people who come to the U.S. across the southern border, President Donald Trump said Friday that the border would be sealed off mostly and even beyond, but mostly during this global pandemic. So here are some of the changes that have been made. So the U.S. and Mexico limit cross-border travel. On March 20th, the U.S. and Mexico announced they're limiting non-essential travel across their shared border to curb movement during the pandemic. Exceptions include traveling for medical purposes or work, or to attend school, among others, according to a regulation notice sent to be published March 24th. The U.S. also took the step of barring entry to migrants illegally crossing the southern border. At the direction of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Department of Homeland Security will suspend entry of all migrants seeking to enter the U.S. without proper travel documentation for both the northern and southern border, Acting Secretary Chad Wolf said. Migrants who are apprehended at the border will either be quickly removed or repatriated to their origin countries. Next, ICE changes immigration enforcement operations. March 18th, Immigration and Customs Enforcement told congressional staffers that it has temporarily adjusted its enforcement posture, according to a memo obtained by CNN, marking a change in operations as a result of the pandemic. The agency said it will focus on those who pose a public safety risk and are subject to mandatory detention based on criminal grounds. Immigrant advocates have called on ICE to dial back operations amid the coronavirus outbreak, arguing that the agency had instilled fear in the immigrant community and might discourage some from seeking medical attention. More on that later. The agency said in its memo to staffers that it will not carry out enforcement operations at or near health care facilities except in the most extraordinary circumstances, adding that individuals should not avoid seeking medical care over fears of enforcement. And DOJ closes more immigration courts, postpones hearings. March 18th, the Justice Department closed an additional 10 immigration courts spread across the country through April 10th and postponed all hearings of cases of immigrants who are not in detention. The Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review, which oversees the immigration courts, had previously made incremental changes to the frustration of immigration judges, lawyers, and immigration and customs enforcement prosecutors who urged the administration to close courts for the safety of staff and immigrants. Next, U.S. and Canada suspend most cross-border travel. March 18th, again, the United States and Canada announced plans to suspend non-essential travel between the two countries because of the pandemic. Trump tweeted, "We will be, by mutual consent, temporarily closing our northern border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Trade will not be affected. Details to follow." Refugee admissions paused. Again, March 18th, the United States paused refugee admissions. The move comes after the International Organization for Migration, which is in charge of booking refugees' travel, and the UN Refugee Agency announced a suspension of resettlement travel. The agency shared concerns in a statement this week saying international travel could increase the exposure of refugees to the virus. The pause is expected to be in place from March 19th through April 6th. And ICE suspends some deportation flights. Again, March 18th. ICE told CNN that removal flights to Italy, China, and South Korea have been suspended. While the situation is quickly evolving, however, ICE is continuing to deport immigrants. Prior to boarding, however, immigrants undergo a temperature screening. Anyone with a temperature of 100.4 degrees or higher is referred to a medical provider, according to ICE's website. And USCIS suspends in-person services. March 17th. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services announced it's suspending its in-person services, including all interviews and naturalization ceremonies, to help mitigate the spread of coronavirus. USCIS is responsible for administering the nation's legal immigration system, including green cards, citizenship and asylum, and refugee processing. It administers naturalization ceremonies across the country, one of the most public and cherished duties the agency carries out. The suspension will extend until at least April 1st. And ICE reschedules in-person check-ins and pushes back timeline for recent arrivals. March 17th, ICE notified congressional staffers that it will temporarily reschedule in-person appointments of immigrants who are not in detention to minimize the impact of coronavirus. The agency will also allow those recently released from the southern border to check in at 60 days instead of 30 days. And Guatemala says it's suspending asylum agreement with the U.S. March 17th, an asylum agreement between the United States and Guatemala was suspended out of caution over the coronavirus, Guatemala's government announced, a setback for the Trump administration, which has increasingly relied on its accord with the country to curb asylum. The move came a day after Alejandro Giammattei, president of Guatemala, said the country was closing its borders in an attempt to prevent the virus's spread. And there's more. U.S. extends travel restrictions to the UK and Ireland. March 16th. Americans, legal permanent residents, and their immediate families returning from Ireland and the United Kingdom began to be funneled into 13 select U.S. airports, where they went through an enhanced screening, according to the Department of Homeland Security. The two countries had been initially excluded from travel restrictions related to coronavirus. And ICE announces a temporary end to social visitation at detention facilities. March 13th. ICE said it ceased social visitation in all of its detention facilities. The agency had previously announced that it had put protocols in place in accordance with guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to protect staff and detainees. And U.S. implements Europe travel restrictions. March 13th, the Trump administration added more countries to its list of travel restrictions to curb the spread of the coronavirus. Earlier this year, the administration had restricted travel from China and Iran. Most foreign nationals who were in Europe's Schengen area, 26 countries stretching from Iceland to Greece, in the past 14 days are barred from entering the U.S. American citizens, green card holders, and immediate family members are exempt from the travel ban, but will face additional health screening and restrictions when they arrive. The restrictions led to prolonged wait times at select airports, with passengers squeezed together and waiting to get through U.S. customs after returning from overseas. And finally, migrant children no longer placed in Washington State and California. On March 10th, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the federal agency tasked with the care of migrant children, temporarily stopped placing kids who arrive in the U.S. without parents or guardians in shelters in California and Washington State, unless in limited circumstances. The Health and Human Services Department funds a network of more than 100 facilities where migrant children are cared for until they're released to sponsors in the United States. The children are turned over to HHS after being taken into custody by the Department of Homeland Security. So those are some of the changes as of the date of that article that have taken place. And there are a lot of things. A lot of them look like they were taken directly off the wish list of the Trump administration, and some were obviously very practical, and some were a little combination of both. So we'll see how those things play out into the future. Our next article is entitled Immigration Policy Impedes Efforts to Thwart COVID-19. And this is kind of in reference to the above article, although it is not about that article, but it's in reference to some of those activities. And it reads as follows. Business as usual in the immigration arena almost automatically casts vulnerable persons into conditions that would have appalled health workers a century ago and should alarm policymakers as well as health professionals today. The Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General has found detention facilities dangerously overcrowded and lacking adequate hygiene and medical attention. On January 29th, Doctors Without Borders reported, quote, just steps from the U.S. border in Matamoros, there are thousands of asylum seekers now living in makeshift camps with limited access to shelter or basic health care, end quote. However unintended, the system is a jumble of recipes for contagion. Undocumented immigrants in the United States get inadequate or no health care. Many fear to report the illness. Many are likely to fear to cooperate in contact tracing lest they bring family members and friends to the attention of immigration authorities. Intensified incarceration, despite alternatives, and management failure have resulted in confinement in substandard federal facilities, private facilities, and municipal rent-a-jails. We have dense concentrations of persons and confusion over and direct or indirect exposures. These put at risk those who run the system, those who work in or alongside it, those who get caught up in it, and the general public as well. Foreign visitors, students, and special hires lawfully in the United States are not exempt from enforcement or disease. Many are unaware that their visas die, if not especially extended, when their schools or workplaces are closed, even temporarily. There is concern in the immigration law community that individuals here on non-immigrant visas for employment or study could be subject to removal if the situation anticipated in their visas are interrupted, even for health reasons. Federal policymakers should consider whether harsh, arbitrary enforcement in non-egregious immigration cases is worth the cost. This is less quantitative than a qualitative task. The scale is obvious. Persons with U.S. immigration law vulnerabilities number in the millions, and individuals directly involved with enforcement numbers in the several thousands. Migrants, visitors, federal officers, contractors, private and public detention personnel, and local police. Federal policy and practices would put many of these people into close quarters, notwithstanding their health status, and then deport them into places where health care is scarce at best and conditions foster disease spread. To better grasp the nature and extent of the hazard that the immigration enforcement system poses to public health, it is important to see generally how it operates, namely as a conveyor belt with increasing automaticity and momentum. Deadlines for compliance and filings are rigid and computer-run. Agency responses to applications and petitions amount to slow, often erroneous rejections by computer. Agency response to case inquiry or police inquiry is dilatory, so more people are deemed in violation and subjected to detention than otherwise might be justifiable. Many undocumented persons have a good legal reason for relief from enforcement. They have legal defenses, valid asylum claims, for example, or they may be victims of domestic violence or human trafficking, or they qualify for waivers for hardships, or some other valid claim to remain in the United States. Or their violation is inadvertent, not knowing that their employment visa is valid only for a designated employer and designated time. But many are subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, and removal. Undocumented migrants with no more offenses than minor traffic violations may be detained. Until now, public health concerns have not entered the picture except in scandals. For example, the caged babies and refusal of necessary hygienic supplies. The government's price of detention bonds has increased so dramatically as to make bonding out all but impossible. Persons who are scheduled to report in are unable to get timely recalendering information from enforcement agencies or the Justice Department's immigration courts, so their default position must be to show up lest they lose their immigration defense. The National Association of Immigration Judges has asked its employer, the Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review, for guidance and resources on how to deal with COVID-19, and as of March 9th had received almost none. See our previous article for an update on that. Finally, at near midnight on March 17th, we're going to get there, 2020, after unprecedented outreach by the NAIJ and the Union of ICE Trial Attorneys, along with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the courts were closed for all non-detained cases, but detained cases continue, needlessly endangering far too many. The law provides a bit of prosecutorial discretion for non-egregious cases, but current policy and practices actively discourage or, with recent Attorney General actions, effectively forbid it. U.S. citizens have been removed from the United States. Born in the East L.A. is real and unfunny. An international law college, now in immigration enforcement at Maine Justices, urges litigation, but litigation is expensive and slow, and our clinic clients are poor, although that many have meritorious cases. Sorry, that's very strangely written. Albeit that many have meritorious cases, maybe that's better. Anyway, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE policy, dated September 25, 2018, regards as among sensitive facilities medical treatment and healthcare facilities such as hospitals, doctors' offices, accredited health clinics, and emergent or urgent care facilities, in which arrests ordinarily or indiscriminately will not take place. That's not a blanket assurance. On March 15th, ICE posted, ICE does not conduct enforcement operations at medical facilities except under extraordinary circumstances. An easily enforced, clear policy of confidentiality for seeking health care and for contact tracing is essential. Contact tracing. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. Contact tracing. But the privacy rule under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act leaves the door open to law enforcement, and confidentiality of information in contact tracing cannot be assured. Immigration communities are understandably wary. Border control for the possible communicative disease is easier to justify, not by country of origin, but by the individual's health status. Yet it leaves open the question of how to prevent the spread of disease from someone who is shedding virus on either side of a port of entry or secured airport area. That will take diplomacy as well as regulatory foresight and forbearance. The upshot is not that migrants are a vector, but that the continuing enhanced enforcement activities of the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice are a propellant. U.S. immigration law and its enforcement are intended in part to protect public health, not to thwart public health measures within the United States or worsen the spread of disease abroad. But the U.S. immigration system, as currently targeted and operated, poses substantial obstacles, not opticals, poses substantial obstacles to effective public health measures, now notably against COVID-19, both here and abroad. And related to that, I just read something here that says the ICE has just put out a request for 45,000 respirator surgical masks. It's for their enforcement and removal deportation officers. ICE has requirements for 45,000 N95 particulate respirators, surgical masks to be delivered to all 26 ERO, enforcement and removal, field offices. Of course, these are the very masks that our healthcare providers are in desperate need of right now. And if there's anybody that doesn't need to be out there using up masks, it's ICE when other people need them more. Excuse me, drinking a little water. So, healthcare and migrants and immigrants. How is that going? Well, here's an article entitled, "We're Petrified. Immigrants Afraid to Seek Medical Care for Coronavirus." I guess that answers your question. The coronavirus was not on the agenda when a legal aid group 2 months ago invited farm workers who toil in the date groves, lemon orchards, and vineyards of California's Coachella Valley to an information session about immigration issues. But when Luz Gallegos and her team showed up over the weekend, they were cornered by people who peppered them with questions about the virus. On Monday, public health authorities announced the first 2 deaths from the virus in this part of Southern California, both in the Coachella Valley. There's a new layer of fear in the immigrant community right now created by COVID-19, says Ms. Gallegos, a director of Todec Legal Center, who stood with immigrants in the parking lot of the Hemet Town Library, which had abruptly closed as a result of the pandemic. "We believe that some members will be afraid to seek the care they need," she said. Among the questions the farm workers had, if I go to the hospital, is it going to hurt my chances of becoming a legal permanent resident? If I'm undocumented, could seeking treatment make me vulnerable to deportation? If I miss work, as more people are forced to stay home, how will I feed my family and make the rent? As the coronavirus sweeps across the United States, immigrants may be among the least able to self-isolate and seek the medical care that is essential to protecting their health and slowing the spread of the disease. The Trump administration on Wednesday closed the border with Canada to all but essential traffic and was also considering shutting the southern border to those without legal authorization, hoping to check the spread of the virus. But many of the unauthorized immigrants already in the United States face the same threat from the virus as everyone else and are less equipped to protect themselves. Some of those without health insurance fear that going to a public hospital or clinic will ruin their chances of getting a green card under the Trump administration's tough new public assistance regulation for immigrants. Other immigrants fear putting themselves in the crosshairs of immigration and customs enforcement if they step forward for help. ICE agents over the past week have continued to make arrests in some of the regions hardest hit by the virus, including California and New York. The fear that this administration has fueled in immigrant communities is thwarting efforts to protect the public health of everybody, said Tanya Broder, an attorney who specializes in health care access for immigrants at the National Immigration Law Center. Immigrants who are just scraping by often live cheek by jowl, making them vulnerable to the spread of illness, especially in cities where housing costs are high. In East Los Angeles, Latino immigrants often crowd an entire family into a single bedroom in a house. In the San Gabriel Valley, east of Los Angeles, thousands of Asian workers live in overcrowded apartments called boarding houses. They work at jobs that often do not offer paid sick leave, nor the luxury of being able to self-quarantine in the event that they are exposed to the virus. Unfortunately, these immigrants face a very tough choice during the crisis: risk exposure or risk homelessness, said Louise McCarthy, president of the Community Clinic Association of Los Angeles. A low-income worker can't just take a day off. Losing a day's pay can mean losing your housing. Felix Aguilar, chief medical officer at Chinatown Service Center, which has 4 clinics in greater Los Angeles, said that it has stepped up screening for the coronavirus in person and over the phone. "It's a matter of time. We're getting ready. We know the onslaught is coming," he said. Among all immigrants, 23% of those who are lawfully in the country and 45% of those who are undocumented lack health insurance, according to a report by the Kaiser Family Foundation. In most states, community clinics serve people who require medical care, regardless of their status and ability to pay. And some states, such as California, Massachusetts, New York, and Illinois, among others, cover medical care costs for undocumented children. But because of the Trump administration's so-called public charge rule, Ms. Broder said, even when services are available, immigrants may be afraid to seek the care they need. The People's Community Clinic in Austin, Texas, a city with a handful of confirmed coronavirus cases, had already been struggling to manage spikes and no-shows among undocumented patients intimidated by recent ICE arrest activity, as well as the public charge rule, when the first cases began to appear. "I know there are people reticent, but what we've tried to do is reassure them," says Regina Rogoff, the clinic's chief executive officer. "We're here to serve patients, regardless of what their paperwork says. I'm hoping that's how our patients continue to see us." Even before the coronavirus arrived in the United States, having a large population that feels disenfranchised from the mainstream medical community heightened the risk for transmission of infectious disease, says Lawrence Gostin, a professor of global health law at Georgetown University and advisor to the World Health Organization. The first rule of public health is to gain people's trust to come forward. People who don't seek care cannot be tested or treated, and their contacts won't be traced, he said. The last thing immigrants want to do in this political environment is tell health officials about their friends who are also unlawfully here, Mr. Gostin said. More than 450 public health and legal experts signed an open letter early this month to Vice President Mike Pence and other federal, state, and local leaders demanding a fair and effective response to the virus, which would include a declaration that medical facilities are immigrant enforcement-free zones, as occurred after recent hurricanes and the September 11th terrorist attacks. ICE classifies medical facilities as sensitive locations where enforcement is avoided, though exceptions can be made. On Friday, after President Trump announced a national health emergency, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which screens green card applications, appeared to signal that it was suspending enforcement of the public charge rule. A statement posted on its website said that seeking treatment or preventive services